That was my good friend Jon Symons from Sonic Drive Studio. Now, in my opinion, he's got some of the sickest riffs and some of the most badass tones on YouTube. Now, I had the pleasure of hanging out with him this past summer in August of 2024, and I got to pick his brain a little bit about his process. How does he record his guitars? How does he mix his tracks? How does he do what he does? If you have any interest in the process of creating some awesome tones and some really cool sounding tracks, well, you're going to definitely want to join me for this conversation. Hey there, I'm Dan, the self-proclaimed Lonely Rocker. Thank you so much for joining me today. And once again, we've got Mr. Jon Symons here at Sonic Drive Studio on the channel. As you know, I've been traveling in Europe. We're on our way soon to 42 Gear Street 6.
Jawohl.
And I've been hanging here for what will ultimately be a few days, and we're shooting videos for both of our channels, some of which will exist on our channels just because we like talking about all this stuff.
Because we're nerds.
We're nerds.
Yeah.
And some of it will be for Gear Street, but just wanted to mention that. But this is just a collaboration. So I have been very curious about your process as a fellow guitar player who you're kind of a lonely rocker yourself because you do everything by yourself. So from the concept, coming up with some inspiration or feeding off of inspiration, yes, and turning that into a song or a riff.
Yeah.
We both write a lot of music for our channel, so which seems to take over our creative process. I think it does for me. So I'm really curious about his process. So Jon is going to take us through from inspiration to the creation of a song, and I was looking forward to you walking through your process.
Awesome.
Let's get started.
All right.
All right, so as a fellow guitar player musician, I'm always interested in inspiration because where do your ideas generally come from?
So first of all, it's always interesting for me to talk about this stuff because I've been doing this for so long, and like writing and recording riffs and coming up with ideas, I don't think about it much. It just sort of comes naturally, I guess. So it's always interesting to sort of try to analyze that for myself and put it into words. So thank you for this opportunity to try to sort of make sense of the process. But so a lot of times I'll be riding my bike or something, and sometimes I'm like talking to myself, I need to come up with a cool groove or something, because a lot of my ideas are rhythm based because I'm primarily a rhythm guitarist. So, rhythm obviously is a big thing. So then I'm gonna, it may sound and look very stupid, but I'll be like, that's groovy, cool. And sometimes, no, I need something slower, or something like that. For sometimes an 8-string, for example, needs a bit of a slower groove.
Right.
And then I have an idea, and I grab my phone, and I have a simple voice recorder, and I press record. And then, I know, that idea is secured. Sometimes I'll be lying in my bed at night, right before I go to sleep, and I'm sure that people will be able to relate. And an idea comes to your head, and it's like, oh, this is so cool. But then I can't record my voice because my girlfriend is sleeping, or my kids are sleeping, or whatever. And then I try to memorize it in my head with like tablature in my brain, or like rhythmical patterns, like, okay, so it starts ahead of the beat with an 8th note. Sometimes the morning after I actually remember, but not always. So having a voice recorder handy is always a good idea. So that's mostly how I guess the best ideas come to me. Sometimes they come to me when I'm just jamming, and playing some riffs, and then it's like, oh, this is cool. And so yeah, it depends. But usually it's the ideas that sort of pop into your head. And it's like the ideas that you aren't really, responsible for. They just happen.
Now, an interesting question I have for you, because you're kind of in the school of metal and progressive metal, I would say.
In general.
Yeah. I'm more of the progressive rock, classic rock genre. And, we sort of meet at this overlapping high gain spectrum.
Yeah.
I've been a bit more interested in high gain, but I'm not a metal player. But because I listen to a lot of prog rock, is that I love different time signatures. And time signature is an interesting thing because I can turn it into a mathematical equation, say, oh, I want to do something 11. But I've noticed some of your riffs are often in odd time signatures sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I've listened to a lot. Well, let's say I started listening to a lot of Metallica and stuff, and they dabble in that sort of thing. I guess you could say that they're somewhat progressive, but Then later I got into Dream Theater and, Steve Vai and then Meshuggah, which is like a huge inspiration for me. Also, Deftones is a huge inspiration. They also sometimes do weird time signatures. Uh, I must admit that I don't think about that at all. It's one of those things that just kind of happens, and then I'll have some sort of groove in my head, and then I'll be like, hey, this isn't in 4/4. Okay, whatever. Let's just go with it. And
so these odd signatures just sort of come naturally, as if someone was just tapping a 4/4 rhythm.
Yeah.
Right. For me, it's the same. Sometimes I force it because I want to do something like that.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'll just like, and it's just like, I don't even know what time signature is, so I'll record it and have to count it because you can't count and tap out some inspirational rhythm at the same time. So interesting. Okay, so you've got your inspiration. So now that you've got this little voice memo recorded into your phone, where do you take it from there? What's the next step?
Okay, so usually when the time is there to actually start recording stuff, I'll have a pile of ideas and I sift through them and I'll be like, oh, this one inspires me. Let's go for it. I try to not overthink things as much as I can. Just go with the flow and do whatever inspires me the most. And then I take that idea and let's say it's for a guitar review or something. Then I know what guitar I'm going to use it for. A lot of times I will have the guitar in mind. I'm looking that way because that's where all my guitars are, by the way. And I'll be like, okay, this one is for that 7-string because this riff fits that type of guitar. I'll just grab that guitar, plug it into, my FM9, for example, and then make some really raw recordings of that riff because it usually starts with one riff. Sometimes I'll have like 2 or 3 parts on my phone that are connected because I'll be like, okay, this groove is cool, but I need some sort of chorus. And then I'll, in my head, try to come up with a chord structure for a chorus or whatever. And then I just record those parts and put them together. Now, usually for my channel, my songs are about 1.5 minutes long. So it's not like I need to record songs that are, 5 to 10 minutes long. So it's pretty quick process. Intro, chorus part, bridge, outro, which sometimes is the same as the intro. So then I got my rough ideas laid down so that I have an idea of the structure of the song. And I have these templates in Cubase that, I open up and then I can start recording right away. I have a couple guitar tracks set up with a regular track as well as a muted DI track. And then twice, because I love double tracking, a bass guitar track with processing with just where I record the DI. So I never really record the processed bass, just the DI. So it goes straight onto that processed track where I have like an automation option for without the overdrive and with. So if it's like a heavy track, I'll turn that on. Bass is done. So everything is pre-processed aside from the guitars because I keep them as clean and as unprocessed as possible because I want my audience to have a good representation of that gear sounds like without a lot of processing, even though a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but sometimes I get comments like, hey, you use so much processing, blah, blah, blah. I don't. A low cut here and there, to make room for the bass and for the kick. And that information is not really necessary for guitars anyway. And of course, I also have a drum sampler, ML Drums by ML Sound Lab already. The whole drum kit was created by me, mixed by me. And that's a lot of fun because as soon as I start programming the drums, it sounds awesome right away. And that's really inspiring. Like everything is mixed. So the snares are slamming, and you get the energy right away. So it starts to grow immediately because of that. And the drums are like such an important part of the song, the energy, the structure, the groove. So I then programmed the drums, which is one of my favorite things to do, by the way. People ask me, do I use pre-programmed MIDI grooves? No, I don't. I do everything by hand, literally.
Are you tapping it out on a keyboard or a mouse?
Just with my mouse in the drum editor in Cubase, which is very convenient. I mean, sometimes when I have like a verse pattern, I'll take that and copy paste it and then do some edits and stuff. But usually everything is click, click, click.
Wow.
That's just what I'm used to.
Mm-hmm.
So then the drums are done. Boom. And then I go back to the guitars, re-record the guitars, usually twice.
Mm-hmm.
So one on the left side, one on the right side, because of course a stereo sound is always gonna sound nicer.
Big and wide.
Yeah. And it's also how I'm used to hearing guitars. So it's just, yeah, that's just for me how a recorded guitar is supposed to sound like. It's a personal preference. Then the guitars are done. Then I lay down the bass. And then sometimes I do some synthesizer-y things. And then you have a song, basically.
That's really interesting because I like, like I said, we are in a similar setting where we do this alone. So I'm interested now because you've got a structure now.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably recorded scratch tracks for your guitar. So now you're ready to start recording your guitar.
Yeah.
How are you laying your guitars down initially?
Yeah, so just to go back what I just talked about. So first I do the drums, and then after I do the drums, then I go and record all the guitars, but I don't record the guitar tones finalized usually. So I have a couple presets on my FM9, which is my primary like guitar DI recording interface.
Mm-hmm.
Like a high gain tone of an amplifier that I really like with an ML SoundLab IR, like the Dust Metal amplifier, for example, is probably the amp that I use the most, or an EVH, or if it's a crunch thing, a JCM 800, or if it's a clean thing, like a bass guy.
Mm-hmm.
And, that makes it fun to record, and it gives you an idea of how it's going to sound. But, for the finalized product, for my amp reviews or guitar reviews, I really need to have the DI tracks. So I've been doing that for like many years. I always record my DI tracks because it allows you to go back and change the sound. Because when I'm recording the guitar stuff, I don't want to worry too much about the settings on the amplifier and how it's going to sound in the mix. Just want to record the parts, get them down, record the DIs, and then reamp later often. So yeah, then the reamping starts either through a plugin or a modeler or a real amplifier with a load box, or these days I've been using my real Engel cabinet sometimes with a mic, which is loud.
Sure your neighbors love you?
Yeah, I'm sure they love me.
Sorry, neighbors.
But yeah, that's basically...
So really, I mean, and you've shared your process with me in the past, and my process has evolved. I've been learning a lot because I recently got into modeling in the past year and realizing that they're great tools for those of us who actually like real amplifiers. There's no like debate in our circles where they coexist in beautiful harmony because they're there for convenience, they're there for functionality because of the signal routing and the ability to record those guitar tracks and have a really great sounding tone out of a fractal, for example, and feel good while you're laying that track down, but simultaneously recording the DI. So if you are doing a review, you want to pay special attention to that amplifier. Let's go back to your amp. So then you don't have to worry about it during the recording stage. Now you can take your hands off the guitar. You can turn dials in real time and get the amp sounding the way you want for whatever you're demonstrating in the video.
Yeah, then you can just focus on the thing that's important at that time. And you don't have to commit to a certain setting and later be like, oh, I wish I turned the treble up more. It's a little bit too dark or whatever. And that's one of the beautiful things about using IRs as well, is like when you use IRs either through reamping or in a plugin, for example, it's very easy to go like, hey, okay, maybe the amplifier sounds a little bit too bright here. So then I could either go back to the amplifier and reamp again, which I sometimes do, or in a plugin, you just tweak control and that's, much quicker. Or you can grab a different IR with a different speaker type or a different microphone type or a different microphone position just to sort of, get the balance right a little bit more. So there are many ways to, quickly change the sound if need be, if you have some DI tracks in your session.
And if you're reamping through something like a fractal, you can host your cab IRs in the Fractal, but
Yeah.
there's also other plugins like
Yeah.
like ML Sound Labs, like Miko 2
Yeah.
and things like that.
Mhm.
So if you reamp without a cabinet, then you could
Yeah.
just change the cabinet and not have to reamp again, because now you have the raw amp. If you want to change the cabinet, if you
Yeah.
reamped through the Fractal and hosted your cab irs, then you have to
Yeah.
reamp the whole thing again. So
one thing that I've recently been using more is the ML Sound Lab Miko 2 plugin that you mentioned. Like, the cool thing about that platform is that you can go in and tweak the microphone positions and stuff. And then when you've settled on a sound, not only is that sound done within the plugin, but you can also export that into a Wave IR and then take that into your modeler. So that's like insanely convenient. So like, in terms of the possibilities and the workflow and whatever we can do, you know, it's so flexible, and yeah, it's a lot of fun.
all right, so now everything's recorded. You've done
Yeah.
your reamping, everything. You've set your bass tone. Everything's in place.
Yeah.
Mixing.
Mm-hmm.
What's your sort of just a general overview of
Yeah.
your mixing process? What are you using, by the way?
So as I mentioned, like, most of the mix is already done before I even start recording in the template.
Yeah. Templates, right?
Template, whatever is the best wording or best pronunciation. But I can talk a little bit about the processing that I do use. So on the guitars, I do as little as possible. Like, I don't use EQ. I don't like to do that at all, because I want my viewers to get an honest and pure representation of the guitar tone. But I do, as I said, do a high pass filter just to remove some low end rumble.
So anything below 90-ish?
Yeah, 80, sometimes 90. Kind of depends on how it's sounding. Or
you could roll off 10K above, because then there's nothing much up there.
I never do that.
You don't do that? Okay.
No. I never feel the need, but yeah. Because if a sound is too bright in that area, I just go back either to the amp or choose a different IR.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like my preferred way of mixing a guitar tone. It's not by mixing, but just to go back to the source and change the cabinet rather than doing an EQ move. Because it always sounds more natural to me if you go back to the source, preferably on the amp. Say, oh, it's way too bright. You're going to have to go back and reamp it with a little bit less presence, for example, but that will give you more natural results, in my opinion, than going into the EQ and shaving off some of the low end. But that's just personal preference. Now, the drums, which is of course very important, are mixed and processed. I have some videos on my channel on what I like to do. Compression, of course. Like, I use a lot of Slate stuff, a lot. So like the virtual tape machines, the virtual console collection is on everything, just because it gives a very subtle cohesiveness to the entire mix and a sort of analog feel. Mm-hmm. It's not gonna give you a very different sound on the guitars. It's not gonna, completely change the guitar tone. It's just gonna slightly gel everything together and bring it a little bit more forward, but it's very subtle. But I like that a lot. So ever since VCC by Slate and VTM, so the virtual tape machines, were released, I've been using that on everything. And now when I take that off, it feels a little bit too sterile and pokey to me. So I'm very used to that sound. And then I use the virtual mix rack a lot with like the SSL EQ. And then the Monster is one of my favorite compressors, which is a free one. It's like 1176 on steroids with the all buttons in mode. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Where they press in all the buttons and then it's like totally explosive. And then in parallel, so on the snare, for example, stuff like that. And the bass guitar has Helix Native on it for the main processing with a bass amp, and then a drive pedal in parallel, the Timmy pedal, and then some processing after, some compression, some EQ. And on the master bus, I have like a limiter from the Pro L from FabFilter. Also some Slate stuff, but it's pretty transparent, so it's not there to really change the sound. I have some stuff adding a little bit of top end, because on YouTube sometimes I've noticed that the YouTube compression sort of makes things a little bit darker. So I'm boosting a little bit of top end to add some clarity, so that you always sort of hear the openness a little bit better on the YouTube videos. A little bit of bus compression to, again, keep it cohesive. But then when there are like isolated guitar sections, the compressor doesn't really kick in, because it really responds to the punchiness of the drums. So yeah, it's just to make everything gel together a little bit and to make it sound exciting without interfering too much with the natural sound of the guitars, which is the focus of my channel anyway.
One thing you had mentioned to me about your drums is that you use like a filter plug-in to boost the kick drum a little bit, and then you
Yes.
also pull down a little bit around 300K just to just sort of pull something out of the drums so it doesn't conflict with the guitars. Or
Yeah, so I do cut a lot of mids out of the drums because naturally drums have a lot of boxy frequencies, like especially the toms, the kick, and basically every mic on a drum kit needs a bit of mid cut for my music because a kick needs low end and the top end for the click, but not a lot of like kong, 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 those mids.
Yeah.
Same for the snare, but in a different place in the spectrum. So the low end of a snare will be around 200 hertz, and with a kick, 50 hertz, whatever. So you need to be careful where you take the mids out, if necessary at all, but because sometimes it's not necessary. But with overheads as well, because with overhead mics, it's very washy. So there's a lot of information going on in the mids at all times. And that sort of thing gets in the way of guitars. So, and of course, again, since I'm on a guitar channel, I want the guitars to be in focus, but at the same time, I don't want them to be super loud in comparison to the drums. So I just shape the drums in such a way that the guitars have breathing room in the mid frequencies, which is of course where the guitars live. And for the kick, indeed, there's this Slate plugin. I forgot the name, but it's a recent release where you can add sub frequencies to any instrument. And I use that for the kick, the Grit ML drums kick that I'm using right now, just to add a little bit of weight in the low end. I've never used that before, but recently I've been using it, and it works out really well in a very subtle way. Just add a little bit of that oomph in the low end.
Important thing I'll just note on something he said is, even though he's sourcing from templates, which he created himself, there's templates, there's presets, and a lot of people get stuck in the trap of presets or pre-templating mixes because every mix requires the work. I mean, you can shortcut all the repetitive stuff.
Yeah.
But every mix requires its own personal attention because depending on the attack of that particular riff, or maybe an instrument that you don't have in another mix, is that it's, presets and templates are a really great starting point, but obviously it ends here. And if a track needs something, then let's not rely on those presets and templates. It speeds up the game for sure, but don't just turn it on and say that it's done, because every mix requires its own personal attention.
I will say, and there's definitely truth to that, but in my case, I try to make templates that are like as generalized as possible, that can work well for extreme metal. But then when I use lower velocities on the drums, that they also work well for clean stuff or bluesy stuff. But then when something gets really old school, I might change the snare or the kick to a more old school sound.
Right.
So again, rather than going into the mix and changing things there, I prefer to go back to the source. So with the drums, to choose different samples, and then of course also change the processing a little bit based on the samples. And for the guitars as well, instead of mixing the guitars differently, I'll choose a different IR or a different amp or whatever. So that's usually, so my templates for my channel tend to stay pretty much the same.
I mean, it's you though, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if you were mixing for different people and you had templates and presets as starting points, obviously we work for ourselves and we have everything's in the same place for virtually everything we record.
Yeah.
But presets and templates don't work for everything. You've created that general approach because if you're making videos almost every day of the week, it just saves us a lot of time. So, but it's important to note that if you are in the early stages of mixing, generally templates and presets are always a good starting point.
Yeah.
But always use your ears to ultimately decide what the track needs. So
yeah, I mean, if I'm mixing for somebody else, usually I start from the ground up.
Scratch,
and then see how those tracks sound and put everything in buses and start from the ground. Maybe start with a master bus preset of some things that I generally like to use, but that's a very different story.
Should mention we are making music for our channels, and there needs to be efficiency in that process. Otherwise we would be in the studio all week making music and we wouldn't make any videos. Right? So
also that in terms of the workflow, because you don't want to mix a song every time you make a video, but also I think, at least for me, to keep things consistent, so that the only changing factor is the guitar and the guitar tone and the pickups and the amp and the IR, rather than the rest. Because if you change the drums every time and the bass every time, then it's going to be harder for the audience to hear the difference between the guitars. Again, because I have a guitar channel, you have a guitar channel, of course, too. So Yeah, that's just my personal approach. There's no wrong or right, but this is just how I've preferred doing things. And yeah.
All right, so the last question I want to ask, and you sort of touched on it because you have kind of a template for your master bus,
Yeah.
which would have a limiter, I assume, some compression, maybe an EQ or whatever
Yeah.
you're putting. Is there any last mastering process? Like, are you like finish your mix and you're mixing into a limiter and you're done, or are you doing anything post mix to master that?
No.
So you've set that sort of that
Yeah.
limiting. Are you mixing into the limiter?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so once you're mixed, you're done.
Yeah. And again, that's also to keep things generalized in terms of the levels. And a lot of that has to do with the levels of the drums and how they hit the limiter. So that stays consistent. And then, it's just a matter of getting the guitars in the right level, in comparison to the drums, so that the mix always hits the limiter at the same level, or the master bus compressor. Or I almost never touch that stuff because I wanted to remain consistent across all my videos, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've been using Ozone for a number of years now, so I'll mix into a compressor and an EQ. Often I'll have a tape plugin as sort of the first thing in the chain. So like tape, that'll go into like sort of an SSL style master bus compressor. Then I'll use some sort of an EQ, and then generally that's it.
Yeah.
But then so I'll mix into that level, and then I'll keep things sort of at a mixed level. And then when I'm done, I'll throw Ozone on as the last plugin and run a mastering process. When I do a full production, I actually mix and master out, but bounce out that final wave. Then I'll start a new project with the stereo mix and then master it in a separate project. But I mean, we couldn't do that for every YouTube video, but just curious that you do it sort of in that one step, which makes a lot. It's good to learn some efficiencies when you make YouTube videos. It's something I need to learn.
Maybe I'm also lazy.
No, hey, listen.
I mean, I've tried the Ozone stuff, and I was like, whoa, this is impressive. You can do so much. But then I'm like, but I've already got my process. But maybe it could be good to get into that stuff and learn more. But I'm just so focused on, making content and all that stuff that sometimes it's a little bit hard to get yourself motivated to really learn a completely new program like that. But it seems like a really impressive suite for mastering and stuff.
Yeah, maybe something we can talk about on another day.
Who knows?
Well, thank you so much for sharing your process. It's always interesting to hear how the other half lives. This is a learning process, and comparing and sharing notes, I think, makes us all better. And I know I've learned a lot just from watching your channel, and now that we're friends, it's good that we can share notes behind the scenes. So thank you for that. If you have any questions at all for him, for me, sure, but if any questions for him, that's what the comment section is for. I'll do my best to forward any of the best questions that you have to him, and we'll see if we can get those answered. Just leave them in the comment section. Always happy to hear from you. Thank you so very much. Always
My
a pleasure.
Thank you.
If you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. And while you're down there, we had another chat. We talked about all of this stuff behind us. If you missed that video, I'm going to put it right here. Make sure to check it out. And remember, you don't need a band to rock and roll, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Awesome.